Hi, I'm Luciana Gabriela Soares Santo Prete, chargée de recherche de CNRS in the Laboratoire d'études sur le monothéisme. It's a great pleasure that I'm able to host today for the last meeting of the year for our project, The Platonisms of Late Antiquity, and I would like to thank the two speakers who kindly accept our invitation and all those present virtually in the room. In the first part, I'm happy to welcome Professor Lenka Karfikova of the Charles University, Prague, who will answer the question, I hope, is matter a principle, analyzing the Christian authors from Hermogenes to Origen. She needs no introduction, but I will quickly remind you some of her best known achievements. Of course, her last book, Grace and the Will, according to Augustine, and her significant articles on Plotinus, Augustine, Origen, and Gregory of Nyssa, among others. Without further ado, I give her the floor, please.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction and your kind invitation. I will share my screen reading the paper so that you can follow it probably better. And you also have some text in the handout. So is matter a principle from Hermogenes to Origen? In this paper, I will attempt to trace the idea about matter in early Christian writers, especially with regard to the question of whether matter can be understood as a principle. This task is complicated not only by the ambiguity of the term principle, arche, meaning temporal beginning, principle, or control, as Tertullian observes, but also by the term matter. This last concept, which in Aristotle replaced the chora as a mere extension of Plato's Timaeus, can describe a corporeal substrate without any determinations, but also a mere possibility. As a mere possibility, matter differs in a very subtle way from nothingness, even so it is not to be identified with it. I will start with Hermogenes. The starting point for my reflections is the three cosmogonic alternatives as expounded by the 2nd century Greek Christian author Hermogenes, namely that God created out of himself, de semid ipso, out of nothing, the nihil, or out of something, the aliquo. It is the text number 6 on your handout. These three alternatives resemble a catalogue of the ways in which the soul of the world creates its body according to Plutarch. It is the text number 7, and were preserved by Hermogenes' contemporary Tertullian in his Latin polemic against Hermogenes, that is dated about 200. The information we have about Hermogenes' cosmogony comes mainly from this polemical writing, and a small part from a note dedicated to it by the heresiologist Pseudo-Hippolytus. It is the author of the Refutatio Omnium Heresium. Both opponents especially reproach Hermogenes with having opted for the last among the three cosmogonic possibilities cited above. It is the text number 8. In Hermogenes' eyes, both the first two alternatives, that God created out of himself or out of nothing, contradict God's indivisibility and perfection in the former case, and his goodness, which would be responsible for the evil in the world in the latter. His decision for the third option, justified, among other things, by the fact that God was always Lord and therefore must have had something he ruled over, does not mean that he regarded matter as evil. Rather, it is something quite neutral, neither corporeal nor incorporeal, neither good nor evil. However, its disorderliness can become a source of evil, just as being not corporeal, it becomes the substrate of corporeal things. Hermogenes also interpreted the first two verses of the book of Genesis in this sense. The principium in which God created the heavens and the earth, and in Genesis 1:1, is matter for him, described subsequently in Genesis 1:2 in its original state as invisible and disordered, invisibilis et incomposita. It is the text number 5 on your handout. It is lacking form and therefore unknowable. You can see the text 9 and 10. quoting Hermogenes. Hermogenes seems to have put a great emphasis on the gradual nature of God's formative action, a kind of processuality of his creation that requires no effort on God's part. For this action, he used, according to Tertullian, or to Tertullian referat about Hermogenes, the Platonic metaphor of a magnet with its attractive force, or of God's movement, which gradually brings the originally disordered movement of matter into a proper rhythm. However, the description of God's gradual shaping of matter, as attributed to Hermogenes in the Refutatio of Hippolytus, is almost like a caricature. You can read it at the text number 11. This interpretation of Plato's Timaeus, which Tertullian too ascribes to Hermogenes, itself seems somewhat wild, and the wild movement of the matter in the quoted part, and presumably does not do justice to Hermogenes. Nevertheless, the very idea of combining Plato's account of the Cora in its disordered movement with the biblical depiction of a chaotic earth at the beginning, preceding God's creative work of 6 days, was not something entirely unheard of. We find a similar tendency not only in Philo of Alexandria, text number 12, but also, for example, in the Christian author Justin the Martyr, text number 13. Tertullian declares Hermogenes' idea of pre-existent matter to be derived not only from Platonic but also Stoic sources, the text number 14. Plato's Timaeus can indeed be interpreted in this sense, as the Stoics, in their assumption of two principles, God and matter, or some authors counted among the Middle Platonists, such as Plutarch or Atticus, tried to do. It is in this last group that the Christian Hermogenes is also considered to belong by some scholars. It is possible that he was familiar with the criticism of the cosmogonic introduction to the book of Genesis by his contemporary Galen. It is the text number 1 on your handout, according to which the material principle is underestimated in Genesis, God creating out of sheer arbitrariness, according to Galen's understanding. It is also likely that Hermogenes wanted to defend Christian cosmogony against the Gnostic idea of an inept demiurge who could not be identified with the benevolent God willing to save humanity. According to Tertullian's and Pseudo-Hippolytus' reports, Hermogenes thus assumed matter to be a principle. It is an indispensable component of the created universe, which is itself neither corporeal nor incorporeal, neither good nor evil, and which, although it moves, is not able to organize itself. Moreover, he understood it as a pre-existent in the sense of perpetual duration or temporal unlimitedness. The doctrine of Hermogenes, which was apparently quite widespread in his time, had earned, even before Tertullian and Pseudo-Hippolytus, a polemic by the Antiochian bishop Theophilus. Both the other mentioned critics may well have drawn from Theophilus, who, leaving aside the uncertain account of the Gnostic Basilides, is usually regarded as the first protagonist of the creation out of nothing. It is the second option listed by Hermogenes in his cosmogonic catalog, the text number 6. Before turning to Theophilus, however, let us briefly record one possible proponent of the first alternative, namely that God issued matter from himself, and it is Tatian. In his discourse to the Greeks, which varies in date, in the second half of the 2nd century anyway, and for which it is not clear whether or not it is specifically directed against Hermogenes, Tatian quite clearly rejected the idea of matter without a beginning or principle, an archos. This expression can be understood either temporally, matter is not eternal, or in the sense of being caused by another, matter has a principle other than itself. The context of Tatian's statements shows that both are probably true. The author certainly wants to rule out the possibility of matter lasting without a temporal beginning, since he is not reluctant to say that before the creation of the world, God was alone. At the same time, he denies that matter had no originator and was therefore as powerful as God. It is the text number 15. In Tatian's exclusion of matter without beginning, then there is a denial probably of both the timeless nature of matter and matter as the governing principle, which is expressed here by the rejection of the same power, isodynamos, as God possesses. The characteristic of arche, in the sense of a determining, controlling principle, can be ascribed to matter just as little as the fact of not having created or not being created or originated. Matter was brought into being or issued, probably, exclusively from the creator of the world. Note that Tatian does not explicitly mention creation out of nothingness. Rather, the term probably issued, cast out, or projected gives the impression that God somehow derived matter out of himself, as we heard in Hermogenes' first alternative. The term probable, which is usually associated with Valentinian gnosis, is elsewhere used by Tatian of the utterance of a voice or a word. Thus, he presumably has matter as a kind of divine self-expression in mind, the nature of which he unfortunately does not think about any further. Be that as it may, it was only out of matter, thus formed, that God subsequently created the world. It is divided and ordered the originally disordered matter. It is the text number 16. In Tatian's view, we can thus distinguish between the emergence of matter itself, not yet organized, and its organization. The two acts of God are apparently distinct, the former being described as issuing, projection, or emanation, the latter as differentiation, arrangement, or decoration. Theophilus of Antioch, as we have already mentioned, the first known direct challenger to Hermogenes' idea of eternal matter and advocate of creation out of nothing, is Theophilus of Antioch. His treatise, entitled Against the School of Hermogenes, which is usually dated about 180, and from which Tertullian and the author of the Refutatio very probably drew, is unfortunately lost, but its existence is attested by both Eusebius and Jerome. Fortunately, we also find some of Theophilus' views on the creation in his three extant books, or three separate treatises, addressed to Autolycus. This is not a polemic against a Christian author, suspected of heresy, but against Greek philosophers and poets, including such authorities as Hesiod and Plato. Theophilus deals with them, especially in the second, most erudite book for Autolycus, in order to distinguish the Christian idea of creation from the Greek poets and philosophers. In this first extant Christian interpretation of the Hexahemeron, the works of the 6 days of creation, Theophilus presumably wanted to offer a revision of Stoic cosmogony, applied, moreover, not to the allegorical interpretation of the Greek poets, but to the biblical accounts of creation. From Hesiod's Theogony, specifically from passages which he quotes in extenso, Theophilus understands that originally there was chaos and a certain unordered matter already subsisted, which in his eyes is probably only a double naming of the same thing. Hesiod literally states that first chaos came to be, protis chaos genet. Theophilus' contemporary, Sextus Empiricus, it is the text number 17 on your handout, who apparently believes that nothing can come into being out of nothing, asks, therefore, out of what it came into being. Ektinos, and without this information, he regards Hesiod's statement as absurd. Theophilus, on the other hand, lacks an explanation of by whom or by what all the beings Hesiod speaks about were made. Hypotinos, it is who ordered the chaos, who reshaped, refaced, and transformed this matter, as he does not consider it possible for matter to reshape and arrange itself. Hesiod's gods had yet to come into being, so there must have been some sovereign principle, Kyriante, that both created and ordered the matter, namely God, as Theophilus puts it. Is the text number 18 on the handout. Theophilus does not use the term arche here, but assumes literally something ruling, as mentioned, Kyriante, which is able to create and order matter. In doing so, he denies not only uncreatedness, but also the capacity for self-organization to matter. His argument runs as follows. According to Hesiod, matter was initially disordered, and it is not capable of self-organization. Therefore, we have to assume an organizing principle for this to happen. If there was an organizing principle, then presumably it not only organized matter, but even created it. Unlike in Theogony, in Plato and his followers, Theophilus appreciates the idea of an uncreated and unoriginated ageneto creator in Timaeus 28. However, it is unacceptable to him that matter should be just an uncreated or uncaused as the creator, and would therefore also acquire a divine status, for it would be equal to God in duration. In Theophilus' eyes, this would endanger the idea of God as the only principle monarchia true, since matter would be de facto a second principle. With the uncreated character, Theophilus associates immutability as only that which came into being, has undergone the most fundamental change, is exposed to mutability. If, therefore, matter has not come into being, then it is, in this aspect, equated with God, isotcheros, and is immutable. It is the text number 19. For Theophilus, the idea of a principle thus implies an unoriginated character, first of all, with which he associates both immutability and temporal unlimitedness or eternity. In Theophilus' eyes, a god creating out of pre-existent matter would be akin to a human artist who procures material and makes whatever he pleases out of it. In contrast, God creates out of nothing. A further difference is that God, unlike the human artist, is able to endow his creation with soul and motion, or reason, speech, breath, and perception. That is the text number 20. In this continuation of Theophilus' polemic against Plato, we find the idea of matter derived from another principle being combined with the creation of all things out of non-being. Theophilus, presumably, does not mean that all things were created out of non-being as matter, but that God not only shaped all things out of already existing matter, as human artists do, but moreover created matter itself out of non-being. This is perhaps the sense of Theophilus' position if we combine his polemics against both Hesiod and Plato. As for the beginning in which God created, Theophilus declares this to be the Logos of God, which God holds within himself and which he begot from himself to be the helper of cosmogenesis. To illustrate this idea, Theophilus, like Tatian, uses the metaphor of the inner and annunciated world, favored in Stoicism. This Logos is called Arche because he governs and rules all that has been created through him. We can summarize that, according to Theophilus, matter is not the principle of the divine creation in Genesis 1:1, as Hermogenes has it. This title is reserved to the Logos in its role as the agent of cosmogenesis and the principle governing created things, as already known to Philo, the New Testament, and Tatian. However, this principle has its origin in God, so it is a principle derived from God. At the same time, Theophilus mentions God's monarchy, which apparently means that God alone is without beginning, and he alone constitutes matter to be further formed by the Logos. In Theophilus' eyes, matter not only cannot be without beginning principle, because it is not eternal and is derived from another principle, as with Tatian. Moreover, it is incapable of self-organization. It is not a governing or organizing principle, and it underwent the fundamental change from non-being to being, and is therefore mutable. Whereas for Tatian, matter has presumably come into being from God by a kind of emanation, Theophilus explicitly understands it as created from non-being. For both authors, however, the creation of matter can be distinguished from its ordering. Clement of Alexandria. In the 9th century, the learned patriarch Photius of Constantinople reproaches Clement for declaring in his hypothesis matter to be timeless, achron. This information seems rather uncertain and difficult to verify, since the hypotheses are only available to us in a very fragmentary way. Clement refers to his predecessor Tatian and was probably also acquainted with Theophilus' polemic against Hermogenes, which he mentions in another context. This does not mean, however, that in his idea of matter, he identified himself with one side of the controversy or the other. At several points in his work, Clement alludes to the contemporary philosophical discussion on principles bearing Origen. In this context, he admits that matter as a principle can be inferred from Genesis 1:2, as we saw in Hermogenes. However, he does not mention his opinion in this context, but that of the pagan philosophers, whom he regards as plagiarists of the biblical books on this point. It is the text 22 on your handout. Does Clement agree with the idea of matter as principle that pagan philosophers drew from the prophetic utterance of Genesis 1:2? Or does he rather favor Plato, who, he assumes, teaches that matter is non-being, meon, and the truly existing principle is just one? Some interpreters take Clement's words of the heathen philosophers as a reproach that these authors had not arrived at the knowledge of a single principle. In this case, his own convictions would seem clear enough, but perhaps Clement wanted to insinuate that while these philosophers understand matter as a principle, it does not seem to be, even for them, the only principle, for matter alone does not have qualities or shape, or is even a non-being. This material principle then certainly cannot stand alone, however much it may be inferred from Genesis 1:2. If understood in this way, Clement, which is not sure, of course, Clement's position, with all sympathy for Plato, would remain less clear. It would have mirrored the debate on this question among Plato's followers. Some of them, such as Hermogenes, drew the idea of matter as a principle from the Timaeus, although Plato, for his part, did not use the term matter. Others tended toward modism and declared matter to be a non-being, such as Moderatus, Eumenes, and later on the Neoplatonists. Be that as it may, Clement certainly did not regard matter as uncreated or unoriginated. Elsewhere, he states that the only one who is uncreated is the Almighty God, who, according to the Kerygma Petri, creates the beginning or principle of all things. Argentor, habantor, ebuiesen. It is the firstborn Son, through whom all things were made. It is the text number 23 on your handout. It may surprise the post-Nicene Christian reader that Clement, with the Kerygma Petri, refers to the Son as being created or made by God. At least the Patriarch Photius took offense at this point in his account of Clement. For our context, it is chiefly interesting that Clement, with Theophilus, understands the Son as the beginning or creative principle, which Hermogenes declares to be matter. Unlike this last author, Clement assumes the beginning to be created or at least caused, and he identifies it with the Son. At the same time, Clement knows the absolute beginning or principle, arche panteles, to be God, who is himself without beginning or without principle, and the creator of the beginning. Clement hastens to specify that the Son too is a timeless beginning without beginning. It is the text number 24. Clement presumably means that the Son, thought coming from the Father, the absolute beginning, has no temporal beginning. For all created things, on the contrary, he himself becomes the beginning in the sense of cause and the principle, and this without time, since even the creation of the world did not take place in time, according to his conviction. It is the text number 25. In the contemporary Platonic discussion of the origin of the world, Clement thus takes a quite clear position, which is close to Philo's. The world came into being, but not in time. For Clement asks, how could the creation take place in time if time came into being only with the created things? But what about his idea of matter? If for Clement the term arche, used of the divine logos, does not exclude the derivation or the beginning in something else, as we have already seen in the Theophilus, is a matter too a kind of created principle in his eye? From his philosophical excerpts On the four causes, we may judge that Clement, very much like Philo, considers only the Aristotelian efficient cause to be the real cause, ideon, while matter is rather a kind of recipient of this action, a necessary presupposition or an auxiliary cause, in ergon. This is the text number 26 and 27. Is matter then a kind of passive auxiliary principle in Clement's eyes, or did he consider it to be created out of non-being, and would he not call it a principle? Or did he understand it to be the very non-being out of which God created? Clement praises Plato for calling God not only the creator, but also the father of the world in his Timaeus. For he understood, according to Clement, that the world came into being out of God, ex autou gegomenai, as his son, that is the text number 28. This does not necessarily mean that Clement also supposes a mother of the world, as Plato did concerning the Hora, or that he conceives of matter as having originated out of God, as one of the cosmogonic options rejected by Hermogenes' state. For he claims that the world came into being out of God alone and emerged from non-being. Elsewhere in the Stromata, however, we learn that God brought each and every one of created things from ancient disorder, tes palaias ataxias, to rest, text number 29. From this statement, we might rather conclude that Clement was working with the idea of an original chaos and its formation. Clement was apparently not quite clear on this issue, as he reveals when giving two alternatives between which he is unwilling to decide. He says, this is the text number 30, either God created from non-being, ekmeo onton, or from matter, the former not existing at all, and the latter being totally distinct from him. It is the text number 30, as mentioned. We can summarize that Clement understands only God himself, whom he regards as the efficient cause of cosmogenesis, to be uncreated or unoriginated. Even the beginning of all creation, the sun, is caused by God as the absolute beginning, while being the timeless beginning without beginning. Matter, on the other hand, plays the role of the recipient of God's action. Whether it is created out of non-being or is in some other way derived from God is a question that Clement apparently wanted to leave open or did not get around to resolving. But he certainly did not consider matter to be uncreated, although he apparently did not conceive of its origin, like the origin of the world, in terms of time. A very similar position was taken, for example, by Proclus 200 years later. In this sense, perhaps, the comment of the learned Photius about the timeless matter in Clement is not entirely unjustified, although it does not immediately imply that Clement shared the position of Hermogenes. Nor are we certain, however, that he, along with Theophilus, would unequivocally advocate creation out of nothing. In their ambiguity to the point of contradiction, Clement's statements actually admit all three alternatives listed by Hermogenes. He did not decide whether God created the world from non-being or from matter. At the same time, he praises Plato for calling God the father of the world, which could imply that the world came into being out of God. On the other hand, it seems clear that matter is not unoriginated, although it apparently has no temporal beginning. And the last of our authors, Origen. Unlike Clement, his Alexandrian follower Origen very clearly subscribes to the idea of creation out of nothing, as presented by Theophilus. In his Greek commentary on the Gospel of John, Origen discussed the concept of arche, and he stated, among other things, the following. It is the text, numbers 31, probably. Yes, 31, sorry. In this quote, Origen not only very clearly rejects the doctrine of matter as a non-created principle, but also openly advocates the idea of creation out of non-being. He may have been familiar with Theophilus' polemic against Hermogenes, and moreover, he is probably the first author to explicitly invoke the testimony of second book of Maccabees and the shepherd of Hermas, which you have on your handout, in considering the origin of matter. This ambiguity might be surprising in the author of Periarchon, where principles are spoken of in the plural. This title, however, was the name of an entire genre of philosophical reasoning, and that did not necessarily imply the idea of multiple principles. Nevertheless, whether Origen regarded created matter as one of these principles surely depends on the meaning he associated with the term arche in the title of his work. The principle or beginning, the principium or initium in the translation of Rufinus, of all things is undeniably God in Origen's eyes. However, he uses the same terms to title wisdom, Christ, comprising the beginnings, initia, of all things, sometimes the Holy Trinity, and even the initial state in which all rational beings form and to which they are to return at the end. The principle of created things is at the same time their temporal beginning, initio, which causes them to undergo change and futility. In the title of Origen's treatise mentions principle, if the title of Origen's treatise mentions principles in the plural, then either the author was simply following the traditional level of the question, or he was describing the three persons of the Trinity as principles, with the other origins only being understood in the temporal sense, or he counted among the principles not only God, but also the created principles. It is the freedom of rational beings and world, which are also discussed in his treatise, Periarchon. In this last case, it is not entirely impossible that he also understood matter as a created principle, since it is the principle of the corporeal world, and as the earth of Genesis 1 was created in the beginning, along with the heaven of rational beings. In his polemic against the immutable principles of corporeal things, be it in divisible atoms, wholes divisible into equal parts, or a single element, Origen implicitly suggests that matter should be regarded as a principium of corporeal things, when he accuses the three rejected views of failing to include it among the principles. But it means matter. He also ascribes to the biblical psalmist and Enoch that they descended to the beginning principium, or beginnings, initia, it is, to the material substrate. In the commentary on Genesis, Origen polemicizes against the idea of matter as uncreated, as we learn from an excerpt from this lost work quoted by Eusebius of Caesarea. It is the text number 32 on your handout. Like Theophilus before him, Origen rejects the comparison of God, the creator, with human artists, because, unlike them, God not only shapes matter, but also creates it. Moreover, Origen points out that matter in quantity and nature, so precisely corresponding to God's intention, could hardly have been available to the creator by chance. If perhaps it were available to him thanks to providence, then that providence is superior to the creator himself. In the whole excerpt, however, Origen does not mention the question whether or not matter can be regarded as a principle. In his most comprehensive extant treatise on matter, in De Principiis 4.4, Origen understands matter as the substrate of quality. But even here, he excludes the possibility that it is uncreated. As it is capable of versatile transformations through the reception of the diverse qualities, matter is, most importantly, a possibility of expressing the diverse moral and spiritual level of created being, rational meaning. In the context of Origen's theology, the idea of matter as a medium of transformation and diversification serves his reflections on the cosmos created for rational beings as an opportunity for them to return to the original unity. It is interesting for our context that Origen's statements on matter as a principle are not always as clear as his resolute denial of this idea in the commentary on the Gospel of John. The treatise on principles, similarly to Eusebius' quotation from the commentary on Genesis, speaks very clearly only of the uncreated nature of matter, to reject it, of course. If matter were a principle, after all, then it would be a principle created out of nothing and, in its quantity and nature, fully subordinated to God's created self. However, Origen never explicitly calls it so. In his eyes, matter is predominantly the possibility of a transformation and a medium of manifestation of the spiritual state of created rational being. In this sense, too, it is subordinate to the will, not only of the will of to the will of creator, but even that of created rational beings, since their decisions influence the quality of the matter in their bodies. In conclusion, the authors discussed in this paper thus represent all three of the cosmogonic alternatives listed by Hermogenes. As Hermogenes himself puts it, God organizes pre-existent chaotic matter. Tatian seems to come close to the idea that God issued matter out of himself, as it were. According to Theophilus and Origen, God creates out of nothing. Finally, Clement of Alexandria seems even to accept, with some reservations, all three of these options. In our inquiry, not only did we find different answers to the question whether matter is a principle, but we also observed interesting shifts of meaning in the very term principle. Rather than Hermogenes' matter as the principle in which God created, Theophilus makes the logos to be this principle, whereas matter is created out of non-being. Moreover, Tatian and Theophilus distinguish the creation of matter by God and its ordering through the logos as a principle originated by God. The same is true of Clement and Origen, who know, moreover, of manifold principles and only sometimes make clear that they do not count matter among them. In both the Alexandrian authors who follow the philosophical discussion on principles, it is clearly denied that matter is uncreated, but much less so that it is not a subsidiary and derived principle. In this development, the concept of principle thus loses the Aristotelian meaning of uncausedness, because besides God, the logos derived from him is also declared to be the principle or beginning of creation. However, if a principle can itself be derived from something else, then it increases the prospects of matter being regarded as a created auxiliary principle too. However, the authors we discussed are very cautious on this point, and none of them, except Hermogenes, says so explicitly. As we remember, the learned Galen, in the text number 1 on your handout, fears the arbitrariness of the biblical God, who does not respect the nature of matter. In the centuries to follow, however, Christian thinkers arrived at the idea of God who, as a sovereign ruler, creates out of nothing, but at the same time delegates his absolute power to the created natural causes, whose action can be investigated and rationally described. According to this idea, the divine power is of an entirely different order from the action of created causes, and therefore does not come into conflict with them, as attested by the text 33 on your handout from Thomas Aquinas. Thank you very much for your patience and attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Karfikova, for the presentation. It was really interesting to see how this idea of creation out of nothing of the Christian Orthodoxy was constructed gradually. And if someone have already questions, maybe open to the other participants. Otherwise, I will put the first question. If someone wants to jump in. I just in the beginning of your presentation, you talk about the differentiation, the subtle distinction between matter as mere possibility and matter as nothingness. Could you just talk a little bit more about this?
Yes, thank you. It is a very good question, which I, in fact, did not follow in my presentation. Because this Aristotelian idea of matter as a sheer possibility is in fact not in the horizon of these authors. So I wanted to just point to this difference, that it is probably not really the same. the sheer nothingness and the pure possibility. Because the possibility, as I understand it in Aristotle, is in fact really the possibility to become something already. So which is not the nothingness in the account of the Christian idea of creation out of nothing. So it is even weaker, so to say, as the sheer possibility, if I understand it.
Thank you very much. Some observations, questions, doubts. Laszlo, do you want to talk?
Yeah, just, you know, this is really an observation or better request for some kind of small clarification. It's about Tatian, passage 15, right? When you say, when Tatian says that Mother was projected pro balestrai, pro beblemene, by the sole creator. If I could remember correctly, but I really speak from memory, Logos is also projected, right? Pro beblemenos. So I guess that, and then again, you know, I really read it a while ago. So I think that there is a kind of distinction that Tatian is making between two kinds of probole. Am I correct here? One is kata merismon. That would be the type of probole in the case of Logos, as opposed to kata apotomen, like kind of a projection apart, which is characteristic for matter, right? And that takes us really to this 2nd century phenomenon of explaining the creation of matter as the kind of projection apart, which we have in Hermeticism and in Gnosticism, and I think in Tatian. So does that sound familiar, or is it?
Well, if I remember well, Tatian does not differentiate in this way. He just say probably, and in both cases, as you say, it's very true that he also about the Logos who is expressed, or how to say it, pronounced by the Father as the Logos prophorikos. It is in fact the same word. So that's why I think it is not that clear how he really imagined the projection of matter out of God. Some interpreters say that it is just creation out of nothing, but he doesn't say so, to be honest.
Yeah, but this, you know, projection apart, like, you know, Hermeticist talk is called and then this kata hapotomen. I think that Tatian does talk in one chapter, I know 4 or 5, about that phenomenon.
Well,
because,
I have to check. But
this
I'm
projection
not sure.
probably cannot be the same for the log of the same kind for the Logos and for matter, right? You know, there must be some qualitative distinction. This is what I kind of. No, that's the sort of. This is a sort of observation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Don't take it as criticism. It was just, you know.
I will check it better because, well, it is not clear, to be honest, about Tatian, and the interpret says very different things. But it is not the creation out of nothing, I would say. Anyway.
Absolutely. Yeah. True. This is true. Yeah. Thank you.
I see that Dylan wants to put a question, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, Lenka, for this terrific paper. And from your handout, I see you're going to have a wonderful paper publication coming out of this. So I'm excited for that as well. I have a question where I invite you to speculate. You observe in your conclusion that all 3 of the basic possibilities outlined for Hermogenes regarding the relationship between God, matter, and creation are explored in the sources that you survey here so helpfully. It's as we all know, we have no witness to Hermogenes' thoughts beyond Tertullian, but after completing your survey, do you have a sense that some other authors, such as Clement or Origen, or later authors, were aware of Hermogenes' work? Is there a reception for Hermogenes that you can discern through looking at the treatment of matter in other early Christian philosophers? Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I really understood well your question or your point, but anyway, the three possibilities listed by Hermogenes, in fact, are not, well, what is clear, that we have the creation out of nothingness in Theophilus and Origen, and that we have the other possibilities, that we have in Hermogenes the creation out of matter, which is the principle, another principle. The third one, the last one, that God created out of himself, is rather a hypothesis for both Tatian, as discussed previously, and also for Clement even more so, because it is just the mention of Plato that he understood well, God being the father of the universe, but creating out of himself. But well, he appreciates that Plato says so, which does not necessarily mean that he follows his opinion in this point. So it is even more weak. So I just wanted to show that all these possibilities were here. They were not excluded, so to say, but the option for this one, that God created out of himself, is rather weak, to be honest. Yeah.
I will make Professor Hellman, please, and then Christopher Sauder.
Yes, thank you, Lenka, for a very interesting and thorough discussion. It's nice to meet again this way. My question backs a little bit on that of Dylan, and these three possibilities of Hermogenes about God creating from himself, from nothing, or something. I've been working on the issue of divine power in a bit of a later period, but I'm wondering, you mentioned power, divine power, on a number of occasions, but was there any consciousness among these authors that either one of these positions, either of these positions would have threatened God's power, his divine power over creation? I'm just trying to extrapolate a little bit from what might have been the most difficult position in terms of power.
Yes, absolutely. That matter would be isodynamos. It is even openly say so as a threat or as a problem, which would necessarily appear if matter is the second principle. We have this comparison with the human artist, which would reduce the divine power just to an artist working with matter which is to his disposal. So in this point, it would be discredit his power, or he would not be so much mighty as he should to be. So I think this point of the power of God, or the God as Almighty, is in fact one of the points, while matter is not being regarded as a principle. I would say so. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And to what extent would matter then be resistant in that sense for the artist? So that would also make it more difficult as a power against God. Thank you.
Well, against God, it is not even in Hermogenes. Even in Hermogenes, it is not an evil power or something, matter. It is close to the sheer possibility, as spoken previously in Aristotle. It is not corporeal and not incorporeal, not good, not evil. So, but evil power, it in fact not nowhere. In fact.
Christoph Sauder, please.
Yeah, thanks. This was a very interesting paper to me because I work on a lot of these issues in Neoplatonism of matter, evil, dualism, etc. I guess I have a very simple question for you. I'm a little bit confused sometimes what the Christian authors mean by matter. In Plato and Aristotle, this is a term that always seems to be used in correlation to or in relation to form. And form, we know, is always a principle. In these authors here, I'm not quite sure that's always what they mean by matter, or if they mean something more like in the Genesis sense of just kind of like all bodies in the physical universe. Or anything you could say to clarify or define that term a little bit would be helpful to me.
Yes, thank you. It was, in fact, at the beginning of my question was something similar. In fact, what it would be, this informed matter, because it is Origen, I think, the first who quotes this line from the biblical book of wisdom, that God created world from the unformed matter. But what it would be, in fact, so would it probably be in Origen, it seems to be close to Stoicism rather than Plato, Aristotle, or to the Hora interpreted in the Stoic way, if you wish. So, being a kind of Hyle without any poetess, so to say. So it comes close to this, I would say. But there is this two steps creation, so to say, the creation of matter in the most part of these authors, till the Middle Ages, the creation of matter, and then the ordering of it. So the ordering of matter would be something like this, probably the shaping of matter, which must be thought of as completely shapeless or chaotic, say, which is not the same, of course. But the first step would be the producing of matter as this, I would say, principle. So it is astonishing to me that these authors are so very shy to say so, because it must be a principle, I would say so. I don't know whether it is a help, but it is also probably good to mention that this biblical line of Second Maccabee and from Pastor of Hermas, which had a kind of apostolic authority, it's first cited by Origen, really, to support this doctrine of creation out of nothing. So it really crystallized rather gradually, and well, I think it is not quite clear whether we have the Stoic Hyle apoios, so to say, or whether we have Aristotelian principle, but these authors does not distinguish it, in fact, not even Origen. So sorry not to be more precise.
Oh, I see that Harold, Professor Tarrant, want to put a question? We can hear you.
Thank you very much for that paper. It was very informative. And I think my reaction is in some ways perplexed, because I don't see as much interaction between the pagan Platonism and Christian views of matter as I might have expected in this area. And in particular, I think the new text of Porphyry that's been discovered, on generally known as On Principles and On Matter, seems to me to proceed almost unusually for Porphyry without taking any notice of the Christians. You might wish to correct me on that one. But one thing I wanted to ask you in particular was, in the light of a passage of Porphyry that is supposed to be recording the views of Numinus. It says that the various words for sea or waves are everywhere in Plato associated with the material substrate or something like it. The word is actually Herculicae sustasis, which perhaps should be distinguished slightly from simply culae in Porphyry, because it seems to me that he probably had quite a complicated view of matter himself. The idea is that these words for sea in Plato always refer to something material, the material substrate, if you like, and just occurred to me it would be so natural for the Christian authors to take the beginning of Genesis and God's hand moving over the face of the waters, to take that reference, if they worked in the same way as the Platonists did, to take the waters there at the beginning of Genesis as a reference to the material substrate. Did anything ever happen like that, or is it not a view that we ever meet at the beginning of Genesis?
Even the earth created in the very beginning, Genesis 1:1, used to be understood as matter, and then the tohu vabohu, the chaotic stand of this earth was also taken to be a characteristic of this earth. Clement of Alexandria even says that the pagan philosophers took it obviously from the Genesis, from Moses. If you find it somewhere, then they took it from the Genesis. So it is the strategy of Clement of Alexandria to show that everything the pagans had reasonable comes from Genesis. So even this primordial chaos at the beginning, even as I tried to show, it is not clear that Clement himself followed this idea. For a matter over which the Spirit of God, it was rather, I can remember just from Basil of Caesarea, that it was the cosmic egg or something like this, but otherwise I cannot say, because Clement of Alexandria is in fact limited to the Genesis 1:1, 1:2. Not going any further to say, but there you have the cosmogenesis of spatial elements crystallizing from the primitive chaos, and then you have water, and then you have fire, and then you have earth as real earth, not the chaotic one, etc. So it has been used for a cosmogenetic, naturalistic explanation, of course, but I don't know whether it is very close to your query.
You look
Yes,
at me.
thank you.
You saw me.
I went to get some coffee.
No, earlier.
Yeah, I saw you at home. I thought maybe you left to get some others.
No.
Anyway,
I don't think it's concern us. I don't know if it's when they are hearing. Oh. So someone has some other question, observations, thoughts? I will maybe thank again Professor Karfikova for her inspiring paper and all the questions, the debate. And it's 5:03, and I will make a pause for maybe 5 minutes, and we come back at 5:10, 5:11, something like that. If it's okay for you.
Yeah, Thank you
great.
very much again for your patience and your questions.
No, thank you to you, really. So just 5 minutes and then we come back. Thank you.